Every single automaker that spent the last decade mocking Chinese batteries as cheap and inferior is now quietly building the exact same batteries. That is not an opinion, that is a supply chain fact. And it is the story nobody in Detroit or Wolfsburg wants to say out loud on camera. For years, the story in the West was simple. Chinese batteries were the budget option. Lower range, lower prestige, built for cost cutting rather than performance. Meanwhile, German and American engineers were chasing something else entirely. Batteries packed with nickel and cobalt. Batteries built to squeeze out every last mile of range. Batteries that looked incredible in a spec sheet and even better in a marketing deck. That was supposed to be the winning formula. Higher density, higher performance, higher price, and the assumption that customers would always pay for it. Except somewhere around 2020, that assumption started falling apart. And it fell apart because of two Chinese companies most American drivers had never heard of. CATL and BYD were not chasing the same trophy. They were not trying to win a range war. They were building something closer to an industrial machine than a battery company. A system designed to make batteries cheaper, simpler, and buildable at a scale nobody in Europe or America could match. And it worked so well that CATL has led the entire world in energy storage battery shipments every single year since 2021. Here is the number that should stop you in your seat. China is not just leading in a handful of battery factories, it is the largest single contributor to new battery plant construction on the planet right now. Picture that for a second. Every time a new battery gigafactory breaks ground somewhere in the world, there is a disproportionate chance a Chinese company either built it, financed it, or supplied the technology behind it. That is not market share, that is industrial gravity. The kind of gravity that eventually pulls everyone else's strategy into its orbit, whether they admit it or not. So what exactly is this so-called Chinese battery playbook that has quietly become the blueprint for the entire industry? It starts with the chemistry choice that Western engineers spent years dismissing: lithium iron phosphate, or LFP for short. No nickel, no cobalt, lower energy density, and for a long time considered a lesser technology reserved for buses and budget cars. China leaned into it anyway because LFP is cheaper to make, safer under stress, and does not depend on two of the most politically volatile materials on the planet. While Western automakers were obsessing over range numbers, Chinese manufacturers were quietly solving the much bigger problem of how to build millions of batteries without getting strangled by mineral supply chains. Then came the packaging trick that turned a cheaper chemistry into a genuinely competitive product. BYD's Blade battery took that lower density LFP cell and restructured how it physically sits inside the pack, cutting wasted space, improving thermal safety, and closing much of the performance gap that was supposed to make LFP a second-tier choice forever. It was never really about inventing a better ingredient. It was about being smarter with the recipe you already had. And that single shift in thinking is the quiet engine behind almost everything that follows in this story. On top of that sits something called cell-to-pack architecture, which sounds technical but is actually a very simple industrial idea. Instead of building individual battery modules and then bolting those modules into a larger pack, you skip a step and build the cells directly into the pack structure itself. Fewer parts, less wasted volume, lower manufacturing cost, faster assembly. China's battery makers pushed this approach hard, and it became one of the clearest signals of how differently they were thinking about cost compared to their Western counterparts, who were still treating batteries as premium components rather than industrial commodities. Wrap all of that inside vertical integration and supply chain control, meaning Chinese companies increasingly own or influence everything from raw material refining to cell production to final pack assembly, and you start to understand why competing on price against this system has been so brutally difficult for everyone else. This is the part almost nobody talks about outside of industry reports. China's advantage was never only about cheap labor, it is about owning enough of the chain that no single supplier can hold the whole system hostage, and about scaling factories fast enough that manufacturing experience compounds year after year into a cost advantage that is extremely hard to close. Now here is where the story turns, because this is not a documentary about China winning. This is a documentary about the rest of the world quietly deciding to play the same game. Start with the most obvious case, the company that spent years positioning itself as the anti-establishment disruptor of the auto industry. Tesla has already been using Chinese-sourced LFP LFP batteries in its standard range vehicles, and according to reporting that traces back to Bloomberg News through Reuters, the company has been actively working to localize more of that LFP supply chain inside the United States. Think about what that actually means. The company that built its entire brand on chasing performance and range headlines is now running a split strategy: high nickel chemistry for certain vehicles and the exact lower cost, lower density chemistry China popularized for everything else, including its energy storage business. That is not an accident, and it is not really a secret either. It is simply not something Tesla frames as following anyone's playbook. Executives talk about supply chain localization and cost discipline. What that decision actually mirrors, whether anyone says the word out loud or not, is the same segmented, cost-driven thinking that built Saddle and Bide into global giants. Ford tells a similar story, but through a different pressure point. Detroit has had to balance the politics of the Inflation Reduction Act, which demands more domestic sourcing, against the economic reality that Chinese competitors can simply build EVs cheaper. So Ford has leaned toward LFP for its lower-cost vehicles and pushed harder on localizing its battery supply chain. Nobody at Ford is going to stand in front of a camera and say, "We are copying China." What they will say is competitiveness, compliance, affordability, all of which happen to be different words for the same underlying shift toward the exact chemistry and cost logic China proved out first. General Motors is fighting the same battle from a slightly different angle, trying to reconcile premium battery ambitions with a market that increasingly demands cheaper vehicles built on cheaper packs. Volkswagen, arguably Europe's most exposed automaker in this entire story, has pushed hard into LFP-oriented strategies and simplified supplier relationships specifically to defend its margins against exactly the kind of cost pressure Chinese manufacturers created. Even BMW and Mercedes-Benz, brands that have spent decades selling engineering prestige rather than affordability, are now quietly building chemistry diversification and cost engineering into future platforms. Because even luxury customers eventually notice when a battery pack adds tens of thousands of dollars to a vehicle for marginal extra range. Then there is the case that might be the single most revealing data point in this entire investigation, and it barely gets mentioned in mainstream coverage: Volvo. On paper, Volvo is still a proud Swedish brand with a century of engineering heritage. In practice, Volvo now sits inside a corporate structure with deep ties to Chinese industry, and its approach to battery sourcing, platform sharing, and EV simplification increasingly reflects that ownership reality rather than pure European tradition. This is not a company that publicly announced it was adopting China's strategy. It is a company where the strategy essentially arrived through the ownership structure itself, which might be the most honest example in this entire story of how thoroughly Chinese industrial logic has embedded itself into what used to be considered purely Western automotive territory. Even Toyota, the company that spent years betting almost everything on hybrid technology instead of a full battery electric pivot, is now treating next-generation battery development as a core strategic priority rather than a side project. Hyundai and Kia are threading a different needle, building genuinely innovative fast-charging platforms while still working lower-cost chemistry and broader supplier localization into their long-term plans. Rivian, meanwhile, is fighting for its survival on cost discipline alone, because for a company still trying to prove it can scale profitably, treating battery pack cost as a life-or-death priority is not optional, it is existential. So here is the uncomfortable question worth sitting with for a moment, and it is worth pausing the video right here to actually think about instead of scrolling past it. If nearly every major automaker on the planet is converging toward the same battery chemistry, the same packaging philosophy, and the same supply chain logic that China built first, at what point does calling it merely inspiration stop being accurate? Is there a real difference between independently arriving at the same industrial conclusion and following a path that was already proven successful by someone else? That line is a lot blurrier than any press release will ever admit. Because here is what almost nobody in the industry will say plainly on record. This is not really a story about theft or imitation in the cartoonish sense people like to imagine, with blueprints smuggled across borders in the middle of the night. It is something more structural and frankly more unsettling for competitors because it means the advantage cannot simply be copied away. China did not just choose a chemistry, it built an entire industrial ecosystem engineered to make that chemistry unbeatable on cost. And Western companies are now being pulled toward the same conclusions purely because the economics leave them little choice. That does not mean China has won every front of this war permanently. The West still holds real advantages worth taking seriously. Research into next-generation solid-state batteries remains a genuine open contest, with Toyota, among others, pouring enormous resources into chemistry breakthroughs that could eventually leapfrog current lithium-ion designs entirely. Premium chemistry, software integration, and vehicle-level engineering remain areas where Western and Japanese manufacturers still hold meaningful ground. But in the two areas that matter most for actually building millions of affordable electric vehicles, which is raw manufacturing scale and end-to-end supply chain control, China's head start remains enormous, and closing that gap will take years, not quarters. What this really comes down to, if you strip away the marketing language every company uses to describe its own strategy, is that the global battery industry did not split into two competing philosophies the way most coverage likes to frame it. It converged into one, and China simply got there first. The rest of the industry is not copying a blueprint stolen off someone's desk. It is arriving, sometimes years late, and usually under serious financial pressure, at the exact same conclusions China's engineers reached first, because those conclusions happen to be correct. So the next time you see a press release from Ford or Volkswagen or even Tesla talking about localized supply chains, cost discipline, or next-generation LFP platforms, remember what you just heard. That language is not innovation marketing dressed up for investors. It is an admission, whether anyone in the room says so out loud or not, that the entire industry is now building toward the standard China set years ago. If you want to actually understand what is coming next in the EV and battery world before it shows up in your own driveway, this channel is exactly where that story keeps getting broken down piece by piece. So to not get caught off guard by what is coming next in this industry, join us here because the next shift is already underway, and most people will not see it coming until it is already parked in their garage.